right, let's get started. What are the challenges of AI chat applications at work? First is lack of context. AI chat applications, they don't know your business or your company or what your customer segments are or your industry. Think about a scenario where a marketing person asks an AI chat assistant to create a marketing campaign email and for selling a product, and AI assistant responds with, "Our product is great, you should buy it," without knowing the fact that who the customer is, what is the business, what is the product, and so on. Next is security. AI chat assistants may not know what your access level is, what is the permissions you have. And think about a scenario where, for example, your AI data set and training data set includes some sort of accounting information. Now a general user can access that information through your chat assistant. Next is data privacy. This happens where, let's say, your training data set, again, includes some sort of user financial information or health information. And now a user, when they query the AI assistant, it provides with that information. And next is compliance, which basically a lot of CIOs, due to these security and privacy issues, have banned using those popular AI applications at work. So last year at re:Invent, we announced Amazon Q Business, which helps with these issues. And within the next hour, myself, Siavash Irani, and Jared Oliver, we're going to talk about how Amazon Q Business can integrate with your Microsoft-based data sources, including Microsoft SharePoint and Amazon FSx for Windows File Server, so you can empower your users with an AI assistant based on your enterprise data. So before we start, let's take a quick overview of what Amazon Q Business is and different features it provides. So Q Business is a generative AI-powered chat assistant that provides you secure and accurate answers based on your enterprise data. Your users can also do like automated custom tasks using plugins in Amazon Q Business. For example, think about if a user wants to update a feature request or create a service ticket just by using the chat without going into a specific tool. Also, one thing is with Amazon Q Business, it respects your user permissions and user access controls. So if a user cannot get access to a file or database or a data repository, using Q, they won't be able to access that either. And it connects to more than 40 different enterprise-level data sources, which we cover in the next few slides. Also, you can create guardrails and customize access controls, topic controls for those responses for Amazon Q Business. Now, let's take a quick example here. What you see on the screen is a screenshot of Amazon Q Business. And think about, I'm a hiring manager, and I want to create a job posting for a solutions architect role, an AWS solutions architect role for our company. So what I've done here is, in my data repository, I had actually a bunch of resumes and previous job descriptions. And I'm just asking Q to create a job posting for our AWS solutions architect. Notice the "our" there, right? I'm kind of making it specific to my company, right? So what happens here, Q Business looks at the index data from different data sources, and it provides me an answer with a job description in this example. It also provides sources for fact-checking. So notice under each paragraph, you see a number, right? Here it says 1, and you may see 1, 2, multiple numbers there. That means basically what were those data sources that this information came from. So if you have multiple data sources, you see it later in the demo, it's going to combine, the answer that you may get, it's a combined answer from all those different sources. And of course, it supports conversation history. So in this case, you see on the top, the job description it provided has some C# and Python skills required there. In this case, maybe I'm not needing that, so I can ask, hey, can you get rid of those programming skills in my job description? So let's take a look at a couple of different guardrails and security controls for Amazon Q Business. Of course, any AI chat assistant needs to have pre-built guardrail for toxicity, for harmful language, for profanity, and all of that. And Q Business, by default, comes with that. You can actually restrict responses only to your enterprise data, or you can have it fall back to LLMs. So you have both options. Basically, if you enable the fallback LLM, if users are querying something which the answer cannot be found in the index data, it can fall back to LLM and get them a generic answer based on the LLM. Also, you can, if those default guardrails are not enough, you may want to block specific keywords in the responses. You have the option to do that. Here I'm blocking, basically I'm saying any answer that has project X in there, just don't do it. So next is topic-specific controls, which is really an interesting feature within Q. So there are specific topics that you may not want your users to be able to query using from your enterprise data. And what you need to do in topic-specific control, you just have to type a description of what you mean by that topic. Here, what I'm saying is, don't discuss our security gap in our, our security architecture. And I can also provide a couple of example questions that users may ask. Maybe something like, assess our vulnerabilities in our system, in our security system, and similar questions. Now, once you define that, of course, you can also define anybody which asks a question about now a security topic or security vulnerability in my environment is going to respond with a predefined message which I can define in the in Q configuration. Of course, there are certain users and groups which they may have to have access to those answers. Like in this case, for my security architecture and security vulnerabilities of my environment, I want my IT security team to be able to access it. So I can exclude them from this rule and give them access. Now, what happens is, as your users within your organization start using Amazon Q Business, you will see different group of people querying similar things. Think about your financial people going and ask Q to give me a financial summary for this specific period. Or maybe your accounting team, they want to get a payroll of an employee, payroll information of an employee. Or in the previous example, we saw how a hiring manager wants to put a job description and get put a job title and get a job description. So as you are seeing these different similar trends within Amazon Q Business, and as your users are using them, you can actually build lightweight applications using Amazon Q apps. And the way to build these are super simple. You just basically have to just specify and just describe what is that app that you wanted to build. For example, in the case of financial example, I can just say this app gets a period of date and then gives me the financial summary of that period. Or for the, you will see it later in the demo, the hiring manager can say, this app gets a job title and provides a description of that job. And similar thing, you can find thousands of different use cases for this. Now, once those applications are built, you can actually publish them. It gets a URL, and you can publish them in your application library, in your organization library, and then you can share it with other users of that group. Very, very useful feature. Actually, if you have worked with Amazon Party Rock, it's kind of similar to that, but this is made for enterprise usage. Of course, because Q Apps is a feature of Amazon Q Business, it comes with all those security guardrails, governance controls, and everything that we just discussed. And Similar to, again, because it's part of Q business, it can connect to all those different data sources and custom plugins. So you can have the app actually not only provide answers, but also maybe update a ticket or create a feature request or so on. Now, speaking about connecting to many different data connectors, I want to tell you about a story which I had a while back at Amazon. So a couple of years back, I was working with one of our product managers, and we wanted to figure out what is that next feature which we have to build for that specific product. And working backward from customers, I wanted to see the feedback from the field people and people who are working directly with customers and figure out what's going on and what is that next thing we have to build. And of course, I'm pretty sure many of your companies, you do have tools to capture feature requests, and a kind of +1 on different feature requests that comes in and add your customer influence there. However, while I was investigating this internally, I reached out to different folks, and I noticed that the data was, first thing, not in one format, and second, it was just everywhere. So I had people where they were using the tool properly, which was great. Those were the easy ones. But I had people where they just had simple notepad where they were just logging things in one file, and they're like, yeah, this customer wanted this and that. I had others where they were just chatting with their friends, like they were slacking, saying, hey, this customer wanted this, or do we have an update on it or whatever? And I had also people which did none of that. They were just, it was in their email, whatever customer provided, and it was really hard. At the time, I'm like, okay, how do I capture a combined kind of view of all these different data sources and different feedback from customers to see what is that next big thing to build? And at the time, we had to go through multiple data transformation, figuring out, okay, this person types this way, this person, don't log certain things. So it was really a cumbersome task to figure out those trends. It took us a couple of months, actually, to figure that out. And I wish at the time Amazon Q business was out there, because I could easily connect those different data sources and basically get an aggregate summary of what the trend was. So Amazon Q business supports more than 40 built-in connectors. You can see a list of them, from Adobe Experience Manager to Atlassian Confluence to IBM DB2 or Dropbox, or I'm not going to read through the whole list. But you can see, some of them could align with that story I was talking about. For example, it supports Slack, it supports, Quip, which we used a lot. It supports Salesforce as an example, right? And now the ones that you see on the screen that are highlighted in green are the Microsoft-specific ones. One is Amazon FSx for Windows File Server, which is our managed SMB share file server. And also you see different Microsoft-specific ones like Microsoft Exchange, SQL Server, Teams, and SharePoint. The two that we are going to highlight today is actually Amazon FSx for Windows File Server and Microsoft SharePoint. And we're going to show you how you can integrate Amazon Q Business with these two data sources. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you, Siavash. So we're going to take a look at how we can integrate Microsoft data sources with Q Business and some of the features of those data source connectors. I'll run through a demo at the end and to show those features that we were just describing about Q Business when using Microsoft products as the data sources. So each of the data sources that we'll be covering today support this set of features, and we'll break them down into three sections: ingestion, permissions, and enhancement. For ingestion, Q Business supports scanning your data sources and establishing which documents to crawl. And I'll cover it a bit later in the presentation what a document is. Once Q Business has crawled a set of documents, It will then start to process them and extract the text into its index. With regards to permissions in the middle, each document in the data source has metadata associated with it. This metadata stores information about which users and groups have access to the document. The QBusiness connectors will ingest these identities to ensure that the data can only be accessed by those who've been granted the permissions to do so. And since we're talking about Microsoft-specific data sources today, it's worth mentioning that users and groups from Active Directory are fully supported within Amazon QBusiness. These identities will be mapped to the access control lists found within NTFS for Amazon FSx for Windows File Server, and as well as the permissions within the local SharePoint Server permission store. Every document has structural attributes or metadata attached to it. These attributes can include information such as the document's title, the author, the time it was updated or created, and its type. You can map these document attributes to fields within your Amazon QBusiness index. And once you've mapped to those document attributes, you can use those index fields to boost results from specific data sources, or your end users can use them to filter and scope their chat results to specific data. The safety and security of your data is paramount. We want to make sure that we're not overexposing the data to people that we're granting access to within QBusiness. One of the key features for the SharePoint and FSx for Windows data connectors is that they respect the access control lists found within those platforms. To reiterate what Siavash said earlier, if you don't have access to the data within the data source, you won't be able to access it within QBusiness either. And since we're talking about data connectors today that support Microsoft products, it's reasonable to assume that you might be using Microsoft Active Directory to store your user and group objects. In order for QBusiness to filter its responses based on the user's permissions, we synchronize those users and groups from Active Directory into AWS IAM Identity Center. The data connectors for FSx for Windows and the SharePoint server will ingest the document content as well as those NTFS and SharePoint-specific permissions. When a user asks QBusiness a question, it will provide a filtered response which respects those permissions. Each time Amazon QBusiness performs a crawl for each data connector, it logs the event to Amazon CloudWatch logs. What we're looking at here is just a very brief extract of one of those crawls. And this one specifically is a crawl for the FSx for Windows File Server data source. For the log stream entry at the top, we have the data source connector's ID followed by the execution ID. In the info field, we can see the name of the file that is being crawled and where it is located within the file share. But the really interesting part is at the bottom in the ACL section. What we see here is that the IT department group from Active Directory is allowed access to this file. The is federated equals true part highlighted in pink is important here because it shows that the group was synchronized into AWS IAM Identity Center. This is an extract of the CloudWatch logs for the SharePoint server data source connector's crawl history. Our log stream and execution IDs are different in this case because we're using a different data source connector. And we can see that instead of an info field, we now have a source URI. In this case, the file we're crawling is stored within a SharePoint server farm running on Amazon EC2. When we look at the ACL section, we can see that QBusiness has determined that members of the portal home owners group have allowed access to this document. This is a group that resides within SharePoint only. You won't find this group within Active Directory. So it shows that QBusiness supports application-specific groups too. QBusiness supports many different file types, from simple ones like Markdown and plain text to complex ones like JSON and PowerPoint. But we won't dive deep into the nuances of each file type because they're well documented within the AWS docs. But the common denominator between all of the file types you see here is that QBusiness is able to extract the plain text from each one of them. One particularly cool feature worth pointing out is that optical character recognition, or OCR, is supported for PDF files. This means that QBusiness is able to extract the plain text from documents that end up as images, either because they were scanned, faxed, or photographed. Before we head into the demo, let's take a look at the architecture which powers it. Starting from the right-hand side, we have deployed AWS Managed Microsoft Active Directory, which hosts all of our user and group objects. We're synchronizing those objects into AWS IAM Identity Center, which we'll be using for authentication to access the Amazon QBusiness web experience. Both FSX for Windows File Server and SharePoint Server have been deployed into a private subnet within our Amazon VPC. We've created numerous shared folders within FSX for Windows, and each have had a unique set of permissions applied to them. For SharePoint Server running on EC2, we have different document libraries configured within the same SharePoint site, and each of those document libraries have a unique set of permissions configured on them. Our users are going to browse to the Amazon QBusiness Web Experience URL and authenticate against AWS IAM Identity Center using their credentials from AWS Managed Microsoft AD. Once connected, they'll be able to ask QBusiness questions and get results from both FSX for Windows File Server and SharePoint Server, because both of those data connectors have been configured within the same Amazon QBusiness application. So we're going to have a look at a demo now, and we're going to look at three things. We're going to cover how to set up a Microsoft data source connector. We'll show how QBusiness respects the access controllers that I mentioned earlier, both for FSX for Windows and SharePoint Server. And at the end, I'll show you what Siavash was speaking about earlier in terms of the guardrails that you can implement within your business. Cool. So what we see here is the AWS console, and we're going to take a look at Amazon QBusiness. As I mentioned earlier, you can configure an application within Amazon QBusiness, and we have three here. I'm not going to show how to create one, but when you have created one, this is what the experience will look like. The one we're going to focus on today is reInvent 2024. And we're going to add a new data source connector for Amazon FSX for Windows File Server. So in order to do so, I click Data Sources. And just to show you before we do, I have two data sources configured within this QBusiness application already. One for SharePoint Server on EC2, and one for FSX for Windows File Server. In order to add a new one, I click Add Data Source. And this is the list of data source connectors that Siavash pointed out earlier. If we scroll down the list, you can see we have third-party applications like Alfresco, Asana, Confluence, etc. And for the Microsoft-specific ones, we have Amazon RDS for Microsoft SQL Server, and Microsoft Teams, Microsoft Exchange, etc. Scrolling back up to the top of the list, you can see here for Amazon FSX for Windows, it says we have one added already because, as I showed, I've already configured one data source connector. But let's add another one. For my FSX, I have to give the data source a name, right? So I've saved one here in my browser just to speed things up. We're going to call it FSX Windows reInvent 2024. We can give it a description if we want. For the source, we need to select which FSX for Windows file system we want QBusiness to crawl. I click the drop-down. I only have one, so that's the one I'll select. For authorization, you can see that ACLs are on for this connector. This is the default value, and it can't be changed. So we'll scroll down to authentication. Here we need to configure an AWS secrets manager secret in order for Amazon QBusiness to have the right credentials to access the underlying data source. So I click the drop-down, I click Create and Add a New Secret, and I'm going to paste the value I had in my clipboard, and it just appends it to the end of the name that's pre-populated in the field. I'm going to use my Microsoft Active Directory domain followed by a privileged user that has access to the content, and I'll save the password. There we go. So we have our secret configured there. We now need to tell QBusiness where this FSx for Windows file server resides within our Amazon Virtual Private Cloud. So drop the list down again. Mine is configured in this one called VPC. And then I need to tell it which subnets that FSx for Windows resource resides in. In my case, it resides in private subnet US East 1A. So I'll select that. And then we need to grant QBusiness, or we need to attach a security group that allows access to the underlying content. So mine is called Amazon Q FSx, and this security group allows access to the SMB port 445, which is how QBusiness will access the content. For IAM role, I need to grant an IAM role to QBusiness so that it can access that secret that we created earlier within AWS Secrets Manager. So I drop down the list again. I go to create a new service role. And again, I can just paste my value in, and I'll add a role onto the end. We're not going to change any of the values within sync scope, but you can see here for the maximum file size value, the value is up to 50 megabytes, which is the default value when you configure the data source connector. And it's able to extract up to 5 megabytes of text from a single file. For sync mode, we can tell QBusiness that we want to perform a full sync of our data sources every single time it runs, or we can choose an incremental sync, which will only do new, modified, or deleted sync every time it runs. In my case, that's the one I'm going to choose. And then we need to tell it when the sync should run. So we can either run it on demand, hourly, daily, weekly, monthly. If you click custom, you can enter a custom cron expression to make this more granular. For the sake of the demo, I'm just going to choose daily and leave the default startup time. You can add a tag to this QBusiness data source, as you can with many other AWS resources. And then the field mappings is what I spoke about earlier in the presentation, about how you can map attributes within your documents to fields within Amazon QBusiness to boost those results when users have a conversation with QBusiness. At this point, you can't change the default values, they're grayed out. But once you add the data source connector, you can go back into it and you'll be able to edit these values or add a new field. I'm going to click Add Data Source, and that's really as easy as it is to add the data source connector for FSx for Windows File Server. It takes about 30 seconds. We're not going to wait. We're going to move on, but maybe we'll see later in the demo that it did actually create it successfully in the background. So I have a Amazon EC2 instance running here, which I've connected to with remote desktop. It's joined to my Active Directory domain, and I use it as a bastion host or a jump box just to perform functions within the domain. So what we see here, and specifically what we're going to look at in this section, is how the ACLs are respected within QBusiness for our data sources. Over here, I've browsed to my FSx for Windows network resource, and we have one share configured. I'll double click that. And we have a number of folders created, one for each department. Each folder for each department has a unique set of permissions applied to it. The one we're going to focus on specifically is the HR department. And just to show you, we have a few resumes uploaded to this folder. If I take a look at the permissions for this folder, we can see that the HR department group has allow access to this folder. So only members of that group will be able to access this content. Switching over to Active Directory users and computers, here's my HR department group. If I double click it and go to members, we see that Celia is a member of the HR department, so she should in theory have access to this content. The other user we're going to use for the demo is John. If I look at John and which groups he's a member of, he's a member of the IT department group. So John shouldn't be able to access the same content Celia does, right? So that's specifically the FSX for Windows part. Let's look at SharePoint server running on EC2. This is my SharePoint site. It's a very simple site with a few document libraries configured. Since we're focusing on HR department, that's the one I'm going to click. And you can see here we just have a few job listing documents created. These are roles that perhaps our company is hiring for. Let's have a look at the permissions for this document library. And we see here that this library has broken inheritance, so it has a unique set of permissions applied to it. Only Celia and the SP admin account have access to this content. SP admin is the privileged SharePoint user we're using within Q Business to access the underlying content within the SharePoint server farm. So, as I mentioned earlier in the architecture slide, we're going to use Amazon Q Business Web Experience to interact with the large language model and see how it retrieves data from our enterprise data sources. So I'm going to switch back to the AWS console for a second. And you can see here, it has created our new FSX for Windows a file server data connector in the background, and it's active. So if I switch back to my reInvent 2024 application within Q Business, and I scroll down, we have a web experience setting here, or a section rather, and this is the URL the users will use to access the Q Business web experience. So I'm going to copy that, switch back to my Bastion host. I'm going to open a private browsing window because I'm going to log in as multiple users. And what we see here is the authentication page for AWS IAM Identity Center. I've saved Celia's credentials into the browser just to speed things up, but this is her Microsoft Active Directory account. It takes a second to load. This is a splash screen for Amazon Q apps. We're going to get to that in a second, so I'm going to close it for now. So Celia is going to ask Q Business a question. She's going to ask, and I'll copy and paste it from my file here into Q Business. She's going to ask, are any of the resumes we have a good match for this specific job listing? This should hopefully save her quite a lot of time, right? So let's hit enter on that. Q Business starts looking through its enterprise data sources, and we'll just wait for the response to finish. And then I'll scroll up. So let's scroll back up. It came back with yes, Jane Smith appears to be an excellent match for this role, and it lists all the reasons why. And as Siavash showed earlier, it has numbers next to certain parts of the response that show that it's pulled data from a data source. And we see here specifically, it shows 1 and 2. So if we scroll down to the bottom and look at sources, we can see here that it pulled Jane Smith's resume from FSX for Windows file server, and it combined it with information it found within the job listing document found in the SharePoint site. Now, you couldn't do this with normal search, especially not within SharePoint, because it doesn't understand context, right? It's only going to look for keywords. But as Siavash said earlier, some of these tasks are going to be quite repetitive. So Celia is probably going to ask this question quite often because she works in the HR department. So let's create her an Amazon Q app. And what it's going to do is it's going to build a query based on our conversation history. And hopefully we can speed things up for Celia so that she doesn't have to type in that long sentence every single time. I'm going to copy and paste. I'm going to copy this block of text in while we wait, and I'll explain in a second what it's for. So here's our Amazon Q Apps Creator. If we scroll down, it says, build an app that takes in a job listing description as a text input and a resume file as an input, and then perform an analysis of how well they match, right? So I'm just going to tweak it slightly. I'm going to paste in that value that I copied, and what I've changed here is I don't want to upload a file into the Q Apps. I already have my file stored within FSX for Windows and SharePoint. So I wanted to use my enterprise data sources as shown here. And I want the app to only require a job title as an input. So let's click Generate. And QBusiness is going to create my app in the background. Will only take a few seconds. And hopefully at the end, we're going to end up with an app that we just have to enter a job title into, and then QBusiness will go ahead and do the hard work for us. So here we go. Here's my input, job title. We're going to search for this role. It's another one we're hiring for. It's a senior construction project manager. Paste that in and click Run. And while we're waiting, this publish button at the top here is what Siavash said earlier, where you can create apps and publish them within your business. And hopefully, if Celia finds this app useful, by publishing it within her HR department, she can make the lives of her colleagues better too. So QBusiness is performing the analysis. We're going to wait till it finishes just because I'm going to need to scroll up and down. But we can see already that it says, based on the analysis of James Barrett's resume, he appears to be a strong match for this position. And we have our numbers here for the data sources. So it's pulled James Barrett's resume from FSX again, and it's pulled the job listing document from our SharePoint site. And again, it's summarized why James is a good match for this position. Again, listing the data sources. So that's how we can use Q apps to improve the experience for the end users. So we've looked at how a user will get a response when they do have access to the content, but let's try and see what happens when we use a user that doesn't. So we're going to log out of Celia's account, and I've already saved the QBusiness web experience into my browser here. So I'm just going to log back in, and this time we're going to use John's account. And if you remember back to the beginning, John was a member of the IT department. So we're signed in as John. I'm going to copy the exact same query we ran for Celia while we wait. Close the QApp splash screen. And for some reason, John's going to ask if we have any suitable candidates for the positions we're hiring for. And it comes back and says, sorry, but I can't find any relevant information to complete this request. And that's because John doesn't have access to either the resumes in FSX for Windows or the job listing documents within SharePoint. So we can see that it does respect the access control list within those platforms. So let's explore the guardrails that you can implement within Amazon QBusiness. So I'm going to copy this query from my Notepad file. I'm going to paste it in. And it's logged in as John still. And John's going to ask about the financial performance of our company for the past 3 years. And we get a different response this time. It says, I can't complete this request because it contains content that is blocked. Please contact your admin for help. So let's switch back to the AWS console for a second. And we'll go down to our admin controls and guardrails for this QBusiness application. And if we scroll down, this is where we can implement topic-specific controls. And I've created one for financial data. So let's click that. And what we can do here is we feed the topic-specific control with some example chat messages. So the QBusiness and the large language model will use these to determine if the query from the user is suitable or not. The behavior, we implement a rule for this control, and the behavior in this case is to completely block the query. And you can customize the message that is displayed to the user. I've just used the default one. And I've scoped this rule to user groups specifically. And we can see down here that the IT department group within my Active Directory domain that's how this rule is scoped. So that's why John is being prevented from accessing any financial information within his company. That's the end of the demo. I hope you found it useful.
All right. Thanks, Jared. So to summarize what we covered, we touched on how Amazon Q Business can help you build an AI-powered assistant based on your enterprise data. We showed how it can integrate with SharePoint Server on EC2 and also Amazon FSx for Windows Server, and also showed you how Amazon Q Apps can help you basically build those lightweight applications. As a next step, look at your environment, see those data silos where maybe you can use Amazon Q Business to get provide your users with an AI assistant, really with just a simple click by adding application, adding those data sources like how you saw Jared showed in the demo, and empower them to work more efficiently. With that, I want to thank everyone for joining our session, and now we're going to open for Q&A. Thank you so much.